Berserk as a series wouldn't be half as iconic as it is today if it didn't have the Apostles in it. The demonic reincarnated foot soldiers of the God Hand may be fodder from an astral perspective, according to Femto, but they're the secondary bosses that have been running roughshod over the series for over 370 chapters. Without them, Berserk wouldn't feel like Berserk. This is why it absolutely sucks that neither incarnation of Berserk's anime adaptations highlights these 10 twisted heralds of doom, because all 10 of them are insanely interesting in their own right. Not only do these apostles explain what it means to be an apostle, they show us the wide spectrum of apostle behaviors and emotions, and how, despite having the same ultimate goal, each of them goes about it in their own sickening way. This is especially true for Berserk 1997 because, while it did right by Zod, it glossed over several other named apostles and simply doesn't feature others that were introduced later on in the story. Well, fear not, purist, because we're here to catch you up on what you've been missing out on. These are the 10 sickest and most twisted apostles never explored in Berserk 1997. The Slug Count. The very first episode of Berserk 1997 condenses the entire Black Swordsman arc into a single 20-minute intro sequence. While it manages to accomplish a lot of things in those 20 minutes, the 1997 version skips over the best character from that arc that truly explains just how horrid apostles are by nature: the Slug Count. See, in the anime, Guts enters an inn, saves a girl named Colette from a bunch of bandits, fights off a crew of evil spirits that try to jump him in the forest, and then kills the Snake Baron before departing with the Baron's Behelit. In the manga, Guts saves Puck from the bandits, then kills the Snake Baron, then goes through his daily night of terrors with Colette and her granddad before arriving at the Slug Count city, which is where the rest of the action takes place. Up until this point, apostles were presented as man-eating demons that could shapeshift at will and possessed immense powers as compared to the standard human being. The Slug Count's part in that arc is what explains to us that apostles aren't demons in human skin. They're actually humans that have reincarnated themselves as demons after sacrificing their own humanity to the God Hand. The Count is more brutal than his reptilian counterpart from the episode we just mentioned right from the get-go. He's introduced whilst attending a public execution of a heretic and challenged to a lethal encounter by Guts in front of all of his subjects. Guts lobs the executed heretic's head at the Count with his brand drawn on it in blood, and this excites the Count because he realizes that the Black Swordsman has finally come for him. This excitement causes the Count to crush the heretic's head like an overripe melon, and that's just the beginning of the gore and glory of his piece in the arc. The Slug Count, as his name suggests, looks like a massive demonic slug in his release state. He has multiple limbs and faces all over the front of his body, each of which he can independently control. He can create pseudo-apostles that serve as his personal thralls by infecting people with a parasitic slug from his own body that creates a permalink between him and his tool. He actually killed his own wife to get his demonic powers, and was considering killing his daughter too before he realized where his line is. He's actually featured in the 1997 anime briefly towards the end, but that cameo is a blatant injustice to his role in the Black Swordsman arc. The Slug Count, a deeply religious human being who tripled as a nobleman and an inquisitor, caught his beloved wife in the middle of a pagan orgy, pleasuring herself on a statue of Baphomet. He killed everyone else in the room, but he couldn't bring himself to kill her, so he tried to kill himself, which is what activated his transformation ritual. The God Hand promised Slug Count all he asked for and more in exchange for a sacrifice, and you can probably guess who that was, can't you? After becoming a demon slug, the Count continued with his pursuit of heretics, but ramped up the scale to the point where it became evident to his courtiers that he was now hunting not for justice, but for sport. The Count's physician personally witnessed him mutilate, violate, and devour multiple humans as part of his inquisition, including his own wife and son. Slug Count was ready to sacrifice his own daughter as well, so long as it meant he kept on living. But then he realized the fate he'd be condemning her to as well. And while his wife might have deserved being in Berserk hell for obvious reasons, his daughter certainly didn't. His entire arc of terrorizing his subjects and violating the sanctity of human life leads up to a moment of redemption that isn't even deserved. And yet the way Miura portrays it, you can't help but feel sympathy for the dead Count and disgust at yourself for feeling that way. Thankfully, that can't be said for the next entry on this list. Wild. When your name phonetically sounds like the word wild, you know you've been put into the story to start some madness, and Wild from Berserk understood that assignment perfectly. The ape-like apostle was introduced right after the Griffith rescue team rescues Griffith from the Tower of Rebirth as the leader of the infamous Black Dog Knights. A squad of former criminals now turned disgraced knights, the Black Dogs have earned their names by amassing a reputation of terror. They are Midland's second most effective fighting force in the 100-Year War after Griffith's band of the Falcon, but they have none of its glowing reputation. Instead, the Black Dogs aren't even considered true knights by the other knightly orders of Midland, and that probably had something to do with the hellscape they leave in their wakes. Massacres and piles of violated women and children were the calling card of this set of individuals, and it was all because they followed the lead of Wild. When the King of Midland loses his grip over his own sanity and sets the Black Dogs on the escaping Falcons, his captains and generals are beyond apprehensive because they know Wild. The Apostle is introduced ravaging multiple women in his off time, but he decides to take the king up on his offer because it aligns with his personal agenda as well. Wild sets out to look for Griffith & Co. and comes across the family of farmers that help them along the way. His motto for every hunt is to excite and enjoy, so he orders his men to rape and kill every person in the family, then mount their body parts on pitchforks as they chase down the band of the Falcon. Wild is the quintessential apostle in that he has no qualms with desecrating anything or anyone, because at the end of the day, he has the power to do whatsoever he pleases. He and his Black Dogs pursue the escaping rescue team through forests, blown up bridges, and worse, and Guts realizes that Wild's men aren't exactly relentless trackers, they're doing whatever they're told because they're deathly afraid of their leader, and rightly so. Once Wild catches up with the crew, his men start turning on him, and he just kills them to make his point. Despite having no formal training as a fighter, Wild manages to keep up and eventually overwhelm the living weapon that is Guts. His sheer instinct is so strong that Wild can turn a club into a mace, and given the fact that his apostle strength allows him to use a friggin' tree as a club, well, we don't need to explain why that would be terrifying for most mortals like you and I. His release date is huge and grotesque, as he resembles a giant gorilla with multiple arms and two faces. The second face has a needled flower-like penis inside of it, which he tries to use on Casca, but thankfully, Guts intervenes before anything unfortunate can happen. Wild has a sword smashed through his brain, and he still somehow manages to continue coming after the band of the Falcon, and it takes him defying the machinations of the God Hand to finally put an end to his menace. When Wild tries to kill Griffith after learning he can't force him to summon the God Hand, he's killed by Nosferatu's Zod for trying to change the flow of causality and taking out the 5th Demon King before his birth. Wild argues that the God Hand told them to do as they will, and so if he kills Griffith, it should be kosher with them. But Zod simply tells him that killing Wild was his own will as well, and that's what puts the Mad Ape of Midland down for good. In his short, dozen-chapter run, Wild manages to assault and kill more people than the trolls of Enoch Village, and that's saying something. He's like a human troll himself, which is probably why neither anime adaptation of Berserk has even tried to touch his character. The satisfaction of watching Wild get dragged down to hell was only broken by the shocking revelation that he was a decrepit old man before his transformation. But considering his life's motto, that isn't surprising to us anymore. Hound Apostle. This guy was actually featured in the 2016 Berserk series, but the way they adapted him just turned him into a completely different character. The Keeper of the Hounds was an amalgamation of characters from the Black Swordsman arc and Guts' encounter with Farnace from chapters 120 through 125. He had an original backstory, and the fight sequence between him and Guts was made completely from scratch. By contrast, the Hound Apostle that shows up in chapter 93 of the Berserk manga is a nameless nobody. But he does have the distinction of canonically being the first apostle Guts kills in his quest as the Black Swordsman, so let's take a closer look at him. The Hound Apostle is named so by us because, much like a bloodhound, his nose can pick up a scent from several miles away. Don't just take our word for it, he'll tell you so himself. What makes him such a twisted character is that he follows Guts and Casca to Godot's home right after the eclipse breaks. This means that the Hound bastard followed the scent of the brand for days on end until he finally came across his targets. And why did he follow them? To eat them and fulfill the sacrifice, of course. In the 2016 anime, they had a weird storyline where the Keeper of the Hounds fell in love with the daughter of a count and then ended up eating half of her body and all of her family once he became an apostle. You might think that coming across a deserted mansion in the middle of nowhere and then fighting a demon monster and multiple dogs is sick and twisted, but we'd argue said demon following you for several miles just to get a taste of your flesh is sicker and even more twisted. Guts also doesn't have Dragon Slayer in his initial face-off with this guy, so the Hound Apostle really puts the fear of God into his companions, Erica, Rickard, and Godot. Once Guts gets tossed into Godot's armory shed and lays his eyes on Dragon Slayer though, it's game over for Hound Boy over here. Though the Hound Apostle can control the intestines spilling from his belly like tentacles, he can't do jack if he's been cut in half. And that's exactly what Guts does with his first swing of the Dragon Slayer. It's just as well too, because there's no telling if we'd even have Casca in the series anymore if the Hound decided to go for her first. Though the Hound Apostle has a limited role in the series, he should have shown up in the ending sequence of Berserk 1997, where Guts departs from Godot's cave with his brand new sword. Because he doesn't, here we are. Rosine! Another character that we briefly glimpse in both adaptations but are never properly introduced to, Rosine is the other character from Berserk whose arc will never be animated alongside Wild. The reasons are similar to Wild's in that the Lost Children arc is quite possibly the most viscerally disgusting arc of Berserk. But if there were a category of apostles called tragic apostles, then Rosine would be the definition of it. She was just a child when she found her Behelit. She would often play with her friend Jill and pretend to be an elf from the Misty Valley because, quite frankly, her imaginary world was far better than her real one. Rosine came from an extremely broken home. The circumstances of her birth became dubious when her mother was violated by a soldier that was raiding Rosine's home village with his comrades. Her father never thought of her as his own and would often take out his frustrations on both Rosine and her mother. One day, things reached their breaking point and Rosine fled to the Misty Valley, hoping to meet elves. She didn't meet them, but she did end up becoming one, kind of. After spending a few days up in the valley, Rosine's parents came across her and tried to bring her back. Well, her mom did. Her dad went back to his usual abusive song and dance. This was enough to push Rosine into sacrificing both of her parents so she could become the elf she always wanted to be and escape the horrors of her previous life. Sadly, she ended up becoming a worse monster than her father because Rosine would routinely kidnap children from her home village, turn them into elfin pseudo-apostles, and then have them attack the villagers to propagate the entire cycle all over again. She would have her minions play war, except these weren't simulations. Those transformed kids were literally killing and violating each other to death. Rosine's fight with Guts is one of the most harrowing fights in all of Berserk, not just because of the sheer number of children involved, which is the primary reason you won't see the Lost Children arc animated, but also because of just how durable she was as an opponent. Rosine possessed the ability to reach supersonic speeds, which was evidenced as a sonic boom in her base elf form, but as a fighter jet at Mach 2.5 in her fully released state. In this transformation, Rosine becomes a giant wasp-like creature with a stinger so huge it would have turned Guts into a spit roast if it had entered his body head first. She also showed absolutely no remorse for the people whose lives she ruined during their fight, which is made worse by the fact that she admitted her actions were motivated by her inability to find a place in the world for herself. Rosine as an apostle is both a warning and a lesson. She was a child that ended up becoming an apostle because she felt things that a lot of children sadly feel these days. The fact that she didn't know what the Behelit actually did makes her monstrous acts that much more morally ambiguous. Yes, Rosine did all that we're saying she did and more. She is likely the youngest apostle in Berserk history, certainly the only one that the story has shown to be this young. And yet, she ended up becoming part of a scheme that was much bigger than her, and all it did for her was chew her up and spit her out once it was done with her. In that sense, all the sick and twisted things she did pale in comparison to the deception she was forced into by the God Hand. However, that cannot be said for the remaining entries on this list. Locus. The next 4 apostles in this list didn't appear in Berserk 1997 in any capacity. They did appear in Berserk 2016, but only briefly, and only one of them actually got to fight Guts. But if it had been up to them, all of them would have died fighting the infamous Black Swordsman and bit back from their graves in the abyss. Case in point, Sir Locus, the Moonlight Knight. The steel centaur of the reborn brand of the Falcon used to be a renowned knight when he was a human being. Locus was legendary for his skill as a jouster and his eternal peregrination, as he always moved from one master to another, never quite swearing his lance to a single nobleman. His resurfacing as an apostle would be surprising if we didn't know that even the greatest of men can harbor evil in their hearts and allow it to take them over in their most vulnerable moments. We'll let you guys guess who we're talking about in the comments section down below. Locus didn't become an apostle because he wanted to wreak havoc and eat human flesh. In fact, he doesn't even partake in the feeding frenzies that his lesser compeers seem to anatomically crave. The reason why Locus became an apostle is quite simple. He wanted to serve a leader he could truly believe in. Locus was the kind of knight that took his job seriously, and he realized that no one was quite worthy of his service because no one could bring about the utopia he wished for society to become. That is, of course, until the moment of his reincarnation, because after that, he became convinced that the Falcon of Light will be the answer to all his questions, and this made him one of Griffith's most fanatically devoted war demons. Locus does not question a single thing Griffith does, and that's what makes him such a twisted individual. Instead, he justifies Griffith's actions post-incarnation, and constantly makes moves to help him advance his agenda. He shows up at Shet and mows down several Kushan soldiers before swearing fealty to Griffith. He then becomes the captain of his War Demon Lancer unit and leads them on a raid at the Kushan HQ in occupied Midland, serving as a distraction for Princess Charlotte's rescue. He uses his metallic equestrian form and his seemingly unending lance to kill hundreds, if not thousands, of Griffith's enemies. And worst of all, he justifies Griffith's creation of Falconia and Pandemonium as a necessary evil to bring about a utopic union of all living things, which we like to think is what prompted Rickert into executing the slap heard round the world. Locus is a man of conviction, and nothing is more terrifying than a man fully convinced in his vision and his leader's vision, no matter how much room there is for necessary evil. Locus acknowledges the barbaric nature of apostles like himself to Rickert when he takes the lad to Pandemonium, but he has the gall to say that Griffith gave them a place in the world when apostles are literally hardwired to be foot soldiers for the God Hand from the very beginning. Perhaps he's turning a blind eye to the fact that many of his soldiers have started yearning for human meat. Perhaps he knows it and doesn't care. He also quite possibly sent another Lieutenant War Demon to kill Rickert after he saw the kid slap Griffith, but he definitely felt some type of way about it because he crushed the ledge he was holding onto with his bare hand. Either way, giving the pass to someone posing as basically Berserk Jesus when he's actually Berserk Satan isn't a nightly thing to do in our books, and we can't wait to see the day when Locus realizes just how badly he's messed up, if that day ever arrives, of course. Grunbeld. What's massive, weighs several tons, and is the only thing that can be remotely associated with the namesake of Guts' sword. Well, not this guy right now, because Dragon Slayer implies the sword has already killed a dragon, and Guts only managed to crack the skin of the Flame Dragon Knight Grunbeld with it. Grunbeld, like Locus, seeks out Griffith after his incarnation in order to serve in his army for the New World. He's a behemoth of a guy, even in his regular form, and that has a lot to do with his backstory. Grunbeld lived a tough life growing up. He suffered from gigantism and was bullied because of it. His mother always drove him too hard to aspire to a worthy death, and then she died during a Tudor invasion where Grunbeld was captured. He was then taken to a Tudor conversion camp where he became friends with Sigrun, a noble lady from his homeland, Grant, and Edvard, the son of the Duke of Grant. The trio survived all kinds of abuse together and managed to survive the camp and rejoin Grant as heroes and frontline warriors. But greed, lust, and deceit brought their friendship down in a blaze of death and reincarnation. Grunbeld and Sigrun were betrayed by Edvard, who thought Grunbeld was trying to take his place in Grant's hierarchy, and he ended up being shot through with cannon fire on the battlefield while protecting his closest friend and confidant, Benedicte. With his dying breath, he wished he could keep fighting forever, and then his Behelit activated. Grunbeld was granted his wish by the God Hand, and he rose again as a massive four-legged, corundum-skinned, flame-spewing, honest-to-God dragon. He devoured Edvard, whom he sacrificed even after his betrayal, and burnt Benedicte and Sigrun before defeating over 10,000 Tudor soldiers all by himself. In his normal form as an apostle, Grunbeld is a beast with a warhammer that can cave in the nape of the Warhammer Titan and a massive shield outfitted with a cannon. When he takes his apostle form, he becomes near indestructible, as evidenced by the fact that he not only withstood a full-force assault from Berserker Guts, he broke multiple bones in his body before being ultimately defeated by Flora's Daemon form. Grunbeld is technically undefeated if you ask us, and a rematch between him and Guts is pretty much inevitable. The real question is, will he end up being the dragon that Guts slays with his sword? Our answer is yes, but what's yours? Irvine. Irvine is one of the more enigmatic members of Griffith's reborn Band of the Falcon, but that doesn't make him any less sick or twisted than anyone else on this list, because he too chose to serve under Griffith. Irvine's backstory is murky at best. He tells Sonya that he used to be a hunter and would hunt for days on end, until he became a beast himself. That's vague at best and nothing at worst, because becoming a beast himself could mean any number of things. But Irvine must have been a really good hunter because his whole thing is being an insanely masterful archer. He lands shots that defy the laws of physics in Berserk, and that's because in reality, Irvine is an apostle. His true form is half satyr, half wolf, except that wolf has one eye and Irvine's fur can become arrows that explode into spikes upon contact, unlike a satyr's. When he decides to hunt down a target, he shows it no mercy, like the cockatrice from chapter 333 or the Hydra from chapter 356. But other than that, he's been shown to be pretty peaceful. He has a friendship going on with Sonya where he acts as her apostle protector while Mule is her regular protector. He even helps her with her rallying cry during the final showdown between Griffith's reborn Band of the Falcon and the Kushan Empire. But don't let any of that fool you into thinking that Irvine is a good guy by any metric. He only protects Sonya under Griffith's orders when Mule shouldn't be around for certain things. He also helps put Casca back under her trance and behind shield walls in chapter 372. Irvine is Griffith's man to the core, and his friendly demeanor could be one giant facade to make himself seem hospitable right until the moment he slits your throat open, or shoots an arrow through your eyeball, because we assume that would be more to his liking, but we'll leave that up to him. Remember, the quieter an anime character is, the crazier they're bound to be. And Irvine rarely speaks, if at all. We wouldn't be surprised if he turned out to be the looniest of Griffith's War Demon lieutenants. However, as of this moment, that title belongs to someone else. Rockas. If you'd have told us that a sentient black robe would be the craziest character in Berserk back when the Conviction arc was going on, we'd have called you crazy. But then, Miura hit us with Rockas in the very next saga of Berserk, so who's the crazy one now? But let's put all this crazy talk to bed and answer the pressing question. What exactly makes Rockas the looniest of the Looney Tunes gang? To put it quite simply, he wants to kill Griffith because he thinks he's beautiful, and he'll serve under him until such a time where he can accomplish that because reasons. Sick and Twisted doesn't even begin to cover the complex web of fetishized thinking and devious tendencies that is Rockas, but those words can be used to quantify his actions both before and after becoming an apostle. As a human, Rockas was a member of the Baki Rocka clan, the same assassin clan that tried to kill Guts & Co. as they escaped with Griffith and then invaded Midland with the Kushan Empire and young Master Silat in charge. Shout out to the Tapasa. But what made Rockas boring even to a clan of assassins was the fact that he enjoyed performing his duty to a perverse degree. The Baki Rocka clan at its core is a clan of warriors. They were exiled out of their homeland centuries before the current timeline and resorted to assassination as a means to survive. They kill for a living but don't take pleasure in it. Well, unless they're Rockas, of course. Interestingly enough, Rockas is the only apostle with a name that accurately describes what he is, because Rockas means demon in Hindi, and Rockas, for the lack of a more accurate word, is a plain old demon. He's the leader of Griffith's Search and Destroy unit. What that basically means is he takes war demons and cleans up the stragglers from every fight. And because these guys basically eat human flesh, they end up slaughtering and devouring any remnant enemy force heading towards them. Rockas is also a surprisingly nimble fighter himself, who can use multiple needles from various directions to attack you and can even fly if he wants to. But what's really impressive is his knowledge of how astral things work. He's able to deduce the mechanism behind Daiba's man-made Behelit with a single look, and he often knows more than he lets on about a situation, which to us has always suggested he's still hiding an ace up his sleeve. The last time we saw him, he tried to kill Rickert but got bazookaed out of the air thanks to his efforts. Rockas hasn't resurfaced since, but it's possible Rickert straight up killed him. If that's true, good riddance, and if it isn't, well, everyone better keep an eye out in Falconia and beyond, because we don't think Rakshas's revenge sounds like a romantic comedy, it's an old-school giallo waiting to happen. Ganishka. The strongest apostle in existence, the emperor of the Kushan Empire, the thundercloud of doom himself, it's time to talk about Ganishka, one of the sickest and most twisted apostles of all time. Ganishka lived a life of paranoia and was an evil person as a result of it from a very young age. He killed his brother, then his father, then every political enemy in his court just to preserve himself. And when his son tried to kill him in a vicious cycle, he sacrificed the boy using his behelit and transformed into an apostle with the power of the God Hand. But what makes Ganishka interesting is that despite being an apostle, he had the ego of an emperor, and this made him actively go against the God Hand. When every other apostle was lining up to join Griffith's army, Ganishka invaded Griffith's homeland and directly challenged him in a duel where he wanted to, quote, desecrate God himself. Ganishka employed some of the most cunning and cutthroat military tactics we've ever seen in Berserk, wiping out entire city populations overnight with his Pishacha Gana and rounding up captive women to serve as incubators for Dhaka soldiers, and men to serve as war slaves. During his brief occupation of the Midland capital city of Wyndham, he turned the place into a Tom Savini horror exhibit, complete with impaled and rotting carcasses at every possible street corner in the joint. As an apostle, Ganishka's strength was so immense that no one could touch him, and we mean that literally. His release state sees him turning into a massive thundercloud by projecting his astral body outside of himself and using it to manipulate air and water elementals to turn himself into fog, which he can then control down to the molecular level. Ganishka uses this fog for everything, for cloaking his troops, for detecting movement within his territories, for defending himself, and yes, for attacking his enemies as well. When operating at full capacity, Ganishka becomes a thundercloud whose lightning bolts can fry several dozen apostles to a crispy death. Even Nosferatu Zod, who is arguably the strongest apostle in Griffith's service, is unable to defeat the Kushan Emperor himself, and the only way he and Guts succeed together is because Shirke pinpoints Ganishka's astral body for them. Once he turned into Shiva after forcing another reincarnation upon himself, the only thing that could stop him was a God Hand member, and that's frankly ridiculous if you ask us. In his Shiva form, Ganishka was literally raining hellfire down on the earth and turning his own soldiers into mindless pseudo-apostles by crushing them with his ginormous feet. In his mind, he was making red flowers bloom from insects, so you know, sick and twisted. In the end, Ganishka died a pathetic death as he laid down to the false light being emanated from Griffith in his true form as Femto. But his death also became the catalyst for the world's current state of Fantasia. In a way, everything that has happened since chapter 306 is his fault, because had he not gone overboard in his attempt to kill the God Hand and prove his superiority, maybe things would have turned out differently. Alas, he was destined to do what he did, and now millions might die because of it. Still, at least he got to make it to the final cut of the series. The final guy on our list didn't even get that luxury. Vlad Tepes. The impalement-friendly ruler of Transylvania has been used as a villain or an anti-hero in many anime franchises, and Berserk is no exception. Only Vlad Tepes is the name of the apostle that appeared in the prototype for Berserk, and things were a little different in that first draft. For starters, apostles served a dark god named Vwana directly, instead of being bound to the intermediaries of the idea of evil, the God Hand. Secondly, their presence doesn't cause Guts' brand to bleed, which we think was a fantastic touch Miura added to his final cut because, without it, you really don't get that sense of struggle that Guts had to deal with all the time. Other than that, the Berserk prototype plays out pretty much the same way as the first episode of Berserk 1997, minus Puck. Guts comes across a group of bandits trying to kill a girl, he saves the girl, and then learns about a nearby apostle. He then goes and kills that apostle in epic fashion before departing the scene of the carnage. All of that happens in the prototype as well, and we think it'd have been an extremely cool deep cut kind of thing if they opened with this instead of condensing the Black Swordsman arc, because it hits all the same beats from a storyline perspective, with the added bonus of portraying Guts as the ultimate troll. If you want to know more about this version of Berserk, go check out our video on Berserk, the prototype, right now. Marvelous verdict! But as for this video, we're afraid that's gonna have to be it. Which one of these apostles would you have liked to have seen animated in Berserk 1997 and explored in more detail? Let us know in the comments section down below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed the content, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep struggling, strugglers.